All right, so here we are now with chapter 14 review, the brain and the cranial nerves. And we introduced two new directional terms. Remember, rostral means towards the forehead, caudal means towards the tail, or in this case, towards the spinal cord. The hindbrain is made up of the medulla oblongata, which has very basic functions in the body, as you see, respiratory heart rhythms, has a basic control over the sleep-wake cycle, and if you have damage here, that can result in death. The other parts, I went ahead and jumped to the cerebellum, and we'll do that for the moment. The functions are movement. It has the 3D position in the body. That's what it helps maintain, so that you can walk, chew gum, and talk all at the same time. If you have damage here, it causes ataxia. Within the pons, this is a pathway or a highway for interchange of information between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. We move on up, we hit the midbrain. The midbrain has a set of nuclei called the corpora quadrigemina, and the superior colliculi are two of the upper nuclei in this group of four, and they receive visual input like bright flashes. And then the lower two, called the inferior colliculi, receive audio input or auditory input like loud bangs. And so together these two form the startle reflex. Now within the medulla as well are the pyramids, and this is where the motor pathways decussate or cross over. All right, so reticular formation is found in the brain stem, and we've already talked a bit about it, how its job is to wake up the brain when there's a stimuli that needs our attention, promotes consciousness. The cerebellum, meaning the little brain, is all about posture, movement, maintenance. Remember, about half the neurons in the entire brain are here. It's exquisitely sensitive to alcohol abuse. What else about the cerebellum? It's important. All right, so the forebrain has the diencephalon in it, which contains the thalamus, the master switching center. All sensory input flows through the thalamus except smell. The hypothalamus is the center of homeostasis, such as our sex drive, our hunger center, our thirst center, and our temperature gauge. Now, the telencephalon, moving on up to the highest peak here, is the cerebrum. And remember, it's made up of 6 layers of cells that form the neocortex. This is all the gray matter that's in the shell of your cerebrum, but we have a few bits and pieces within that shell called primarily made up of the basal ganglia. The 6 layers of cells of the neocortex are your center of thinking, where you do everything, your personality, where you perceive all information. The cerebrum is made up of folds called gyri, and the grooves in between those folds are sulci. Beneath those 6 layers of gray matter in the neocortex are just miles and miles, seemingly, of myelinated axons that connect together the brain. So you should be able to name the major parts of the brain and discuss what they do. You should also know the particular outcomes due to damage. And so the major parts of the brain, the ones we just went through, how I would answer this is I would go first the medulla oblongata. It has the respiratory and cardiovascular centers, as well as the sleep-wake center. What would happen if you had damage here is death. The second one I would worry about is the pons. And the pons communicates information between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. If you had damage here, it could as well result in death. What else do we have? Midbrain has the superior and inferior colliculi, which establishes the startle reflex. If you had damage here, then you would lose the responsibility of responding to startling information. The cerebellum is charged with maintaining posture and maintaining position and 3D position in space. And if you had damage here, those are called ataxias. All right, then we move on up a little higher. Thalamus damage would be severely affect your sensory awareness. And so remember that the thalamus is the master switching center, and if you had damage to your hypothalamus, you would affect homeostasis. So really what I'm asking by when, be able to name the particular outcome or outcomes due to damage, I would want to know pretty much what, it'd be in relationship to what its function is. As we move on up to the cerebrum, we'd have to break it apart a bit, and we break it apart into 4 lobes. So I'm going to hold off on those till we get to the 4 lobes, but we'll readdress the short answer when we reach the 4 lobes in the review. There are 3 types of nerve networks called tracts in the central nervous system. So not called nerves in the central nervous system, they're called tracts. And they are either found to be associated with association fibers that connect areas on the same side of the cerebrum, commissural fibers that connect areas on either side of the cerebrum, and then projection fibers that connect with or to the spinal cord and from the spinal cord. We now are going to address the limbic system, and its major role is to attach emotions to outgoing motor commands. And the 2 components that we haven't talked about so far are the hippocampus, which is aligned with establishing memory. So the hippocampus forms what's called your short-term memory. That's just a few seconds to, maybe a minute or 2 long. But then it will also direct your long-term memory formation in the appropriate area of the brain that's responsible for that information. The amygdala is all about establishing fear and anxiety levels, the phobias you have in life, and is also an attention directing structure in the brain. We can measure action potentials in the brain by looking at the EEG, the electroencephalograph. There are 4 categories of waves in the EEG, and those are the alpha waves that you would experience primarily at a time when you're just closing your eyes, perhaps just for a slight rest, or you're daydreaming. The beta waves that are the highest frequency of all 4, when you are very mentally active. Theta waves as you're sinking more and more into sleep, and then delta when you are in your deepest sleep. So in terms of frequencies, beta waves the highest, alpha second, theta third, and delta are the slowest waves, but the highest in magnitude. Know your definition of sleep and understand there are 4 stages of sleep. These 4 stages of sleep get progressively deeper, but we have a stage called REM sleep that occurs about every hour and a half, every 90 minutes. This stands for rapid eye movement. Dreams are more vivid during this stage. That is a stage 4 initiation of REM, but once you get into REM fully, then you are experiencing electrical patterns that are more like those seen in stage 2. So REM is also called paradoxical sleep. Your muscles are paralyzed and you will see your pupils moving back and forth rapidly. Now, we've already talked about the meninges in the spinal cord, but I do want to point out the slight differences. Dura mater is 2 layers around the brain. One layer will stay consistently near the skull, and the lower layer, or the deeper layer, will fold where there are grooves at, like the longitudinal fissure that divides the 2 hemispheres. As it descends between the 2 hemispheres, we call it falx cerebri. When it descends, or when it ascends between the 2 cerebellar hemispheres, it's called falx cerebelli. And then in the space between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, this portion of the dura mater is called tentorium cerebelli. The middle layer of the meninges is very thin, just like it is in the spinal cord, and is the arachnoid mater. And below it, in the subarachnoid space, is the cerebrospinal fluid. Once again, as with the spinal cord, the innermost layer is the pia mater. Pia means affectionate. It is very tightly bound. So here we have the subdural space. We have no epidural to speak of in the brain, but we have a subdural space where you know that damage can accumulate, blood vessels can burst, and that fluid can accumulate in this space and can cause pressure and mounting problems with brain function. So there are two lateral ventricles and a third and a fourth ventricle. In each of these is a tissue called the choroid plexus. And most of the cerebral spinal fluid that's made by the ependymal cells of the choroid plexus is in the lateral ventricles, but there is some also in the third and fourth ventricles. This fluid bathes and cushions the brain and spinal cord. You should know that the parietal lobe contains what's an anatomical place called the postcentral gyrus, where the somatosensory cortex resides. So all information coming from the body wall will be directed to this anatomical location in the parietal lobe. You also have the taste cortex in the parietal lobe. In the temporal lobe, we have the olfactory cortex, the smell cortex, which is the first stop pretty much for smell information in the brain. The primary auditory cortex, and it's the place for abstract thought and where we recognize faces and objects. And finally, it's the location for Wernicke's area. It's one of the critical areas for language formation and understanding. The third lobe is the occipital lobe that has the visual cortex in it and the visual association areas. And the frontal lobe, finally, where the precentral gyrus is located. This is the home of the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, where all motor information commands are initiated from. Broca's area, another major place for taking the word that you've gotten from Wernicke's area, putting the correct context, figuring out all the motor commands that will eventually be sent to the premotor cortex, which is an association area in the frontal lobe. And then the essential association area in the brain is the prefrontal cortex, where your personality is defined, how you're going to laugh at something, how you judge people by, everything is defined, the prefrontal cortex. The right and left side functions. On the right side, you're going to have musical ability, artistic ability. It's a more touchy-feely, holistic type of hemisphere. Also, the right side controls the left half of the body, receives sensory inputs for the most part from the left half of the body, and sends out motor information to the left side of the body. On the left side, we have analytical functions, mathematical, logical functions that are accounted for by the left side. Also, all language skills for almost all people are found in the left side of the brain. It will control the right side of the body, much in the same way as the right controls the left. Recall that we were able to map out the human body on the motor and sensory cortices, the ones in the precentral and postcentral gyri, and we called those little body structures that accounted for the amount of real estate in each of these gyri devoted to a particular location in the body. We called those homunculi. In the motor and sensory homunculi, the face was the dominant structure and consumed the most real estate in both. On average, the corpus callosum is larger in women than men, and you should know it is the white matter tract that connects the two hemispheres. The average brain weighs about 3 pounds, but over half that mass is neuroglia. The possible short answer: know the area and steps for speech processing. I will insert now. I've broken this down into a series of steps. It's certainly a prime candidate for a short answer on the exam. And so we're going to, of course, what I'm describing here is the ability to speak a word after reading it. So I'm up at a lectern, and I've got my speech on notes or slides or graphs or something, and I'm going to be reading that speech. And of course, I visualize it. That information goes back to my occipital lobe, and then it will move forward or rostrally to my visual association area, where I begin to recognize the patterns of the words that I had written down. So as I begin to compare the patterns of those words to the patterns I have in my little files in my visual association area, so I'll have many, many little files, and I'll be comparing what I'm seeing with those files, and then eventually I'll send that information to Wernicke's area, where I report the pattern that I've seen And then I can associate that with the understanding of the word, with its definition. Now I know what it means, and Wernicke's area will send that information to the frontal lobe, or Broca's area is found at. And Broca's area then will convert the understanding of the word, combine it with its context and its emotion, and then forward that information to the premotor cortex that will then establish what muscles I need to tense, how I need to arrange my glottis, my breathing rate, all of these incredibly complex things just to say a word, sends the information to the motor cortex, which then, of course, delivers the commands to execute them. Alrighty, so continuing going back to that short answer that we left behind before, these are the things I want you to know here specifically. If you have temporal lobe lesions, they result in a condition called agnosia. That's the inability to identify objects. However, you should also know the condition prosopagnosia, and that's the inability to recognize faces. Frontal lobe lesions, as you might guess, especially in the region of the prefrontal cortex, would result in deficits in personality. We talked about the two types of memory. There is declarative form of memory, which is the ability to recall past events, and then the procedural form of memory, which is like tying your shoes or any routine you have. And so then we addressed amnesia, which is some type of forgetting, and there's anterograde amnesia where you can't form new memories, and retrograde amnesia where you cannot recall old memories. The hippocampus, as we already mentioned, is for short-term memory and establishment of long-term memory in the appropriate location, and that is consolidation. You should know the type, the naming, the type, the functions of all cranial nerves. One outcome, all right? So for cranial nerve 1, which is the olfactory nerve, you should know if you have a deficit there, that condition is called anosmia. Think of nose, olfactory, right? Anosmia. The optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, if you had damage to it, it would cause blindness. Okay. Both these first two are sensory nerves. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor, so it is a motor nerve. Cranial nerve 3, and if you have a problem here, you would have double vision. That's the one I will use, double vision. Cranial nerve 4 is known as the trochlear nerve. It is a motor nerve as well, and here you would have difficulties looking down or to the side. For cranial nerve 5, known as the trigeminal, it is both. It will have sensory and motor. And if you had a issue here, one of the results might be pain in your facial region. This is a condition called trigeminal neuralgia. Cranial nerve 6, also known as the abducens, is a motor nerve, and you would have what is termed diplopia if you had problems with this nerve. Cranial nerve 7, known as the facial nerve, is again one of those both. It has both sensory and motor components, and you would have conditions, damage to this nerve would result in ageusia, which is the inability to taste, also potentially facial paralysis, because remember, this nerve goes to the forward 2/3 of the tongue. Cranial nerve 8, known as the vestibulocochlear, we will consider as a sensory nerve only. Has to do with if you have damage to it, you would have issues with balance and hearing. Cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. It is a both nerve, and here we would have problems with gag reflexes. We would also experience ageusia here because this takes care of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue in terms of taste. Cranial nerve 10, you will have the vagus nerve is one of those both nerves again. It has sensory and motor components. And if you had damage here, it could be quite widespread and affect swallowing, digestion. And remember also the vagus nerve goes to the taste buds in the pharynx and other parts of the oral cavity besides the tongue. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve, And here, remember, it targets the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. This is a motor nerve. And if you had functional problems here, then you would have an inability to move those muscles correctly. Finally, hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, is a motor nerve, and the tongue moves to this side of the lesion. So what am I going to ask? This would be partly short answer. The effects that you see here, the outcomes for malfunction of the cranial nerve, will be multiple choice purely. But I will construct a table for you, and I will post it in additional material in the review section for you. Okay, that completes chapter 15, onward to 16. And in this particular chapter, we talked about the special senses. The brain tells the importance based on those 4 functions. You should know that. Where it comes from, what type of sense is it? In other words, is it vision, hearing, smell, or taste? That tells you modality. Where it comes from, so not what type is it, but where it comes from exactly, that will tell the brain important information. How long it lasts will tell the brain important information. And the frequency at which it arrives at will tell it important information. We had different types of nerve endings in the skin. We had the unencapsulated nerve types. These are free nerve endings and the touch disc along with the hair receptors. And then the encapsulated type, the tactile or Beyster's corpuscles, found in fingertips along with those Merkel's or tactile disc. The Krauss-in bulbs that are for tactile, a little heavier touch. Pacinian corpuscles that are for deep pressure. And then the bulbous corpuscles that are for very heavy touch. You should know the 5 basic types of sensory receptors. So the first type, and 1 mode of detection for each. You should know that mechanoreceptors, and I'll just give you the easiest one. 1 mode of detection is hearing. Okay, so that's a type of mechanoreceptor. Chemoreceptors, like in your mouth, detect ions. Photoreceptors, like in your eye, detect light. Nociceptors, such as in your skin, detect tissue damage. Don't put pain, I'll mark that wrong. Detect tissue damage. And finally, thermoreceptors found in your skin and such detect temperature changes. Again, recall that the primary conveyor of temperature and pain information is the spinothalamic tract. Pain always begins by the release of the most potent neurotransmitter that activates pain nerves, and that is bradykinin. At the end of that first order neuron, it will release substance P to activate the second order neuron, which carries the information up to the thalamus via one pathway, and via the other pathway, it can be going to the limbic system for emotional detection. All right, so we have 2 types of senses that we always have to consider. Those senses found on the body wall, and then the visceral senses associated with your organs. A sensation is a awareness of a stimulus. Perception is the understanding of that stimulus. Nociceptors are receivers of pain, and we have somatic pain, which is from the body wall, and visceral pain that appears from your organs. Now, because the brain believes it will always deal with somatic pain, visceral pain takes a back seat. And as such, there will be a condition called referred pain that can occur. Think of a heart attack in men especially. Women don't experience this quite as much, but men can experience heart attacks, the pain of them, along their inner left arm. I do want you to know that the reticular formation does have some analgesic components to it that can reduce pain. You should know the 5 taste modalities on the tongue: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. There are about 1,000 genes devoted to smell, in which we are going to recognize around 3,000 different odors on average. Smell is the only sense not processed first through the thalamus. Smell information, however, is directly sent into the temporal lobe region. Humans can hear between 20 to 20,000 hertz, and that's called pitch. Loudness is amplitude, and is measured in decibels. Nothing particularly important there. You should know how hearing occurs, and this is exactly how I will expect the answer to occur. So just memorize this. This is how it happens. So the outer ear collects the sound waves, vibrates in response to them. These vibrations are conducted through the malleus incus and stapes to the oval window of the cochlea, which then transmits those vibrations into pressure waves inside the fluid of the cochlea. Those vibrations cause the basilar membrane to flex. The basilar membrane contains hair cells. The hair is actually ciliated projections from the cell body, and they are embedded in gel-like substances. And as the basilar membrane flexes, these hair cells will bend and open potassium channels, and action potentials will occur. High frequencies result in the basal end flexing, while lower frequencies cause the distal end to bend. Don't worry about stereociliar, but you should know about tip links. The cilia that are projecting off these cells are all tied together via this tip link, and when one bends, they all bend, and they will open channels for potassium. It's very certainly probably a multiple choice question, that potassium is the ion that will move and result in action potentials occurring. The utricle and saccule are responsible for linear movements of the head, for detecting those, as well as anything in linear acceleration. So if you're on a automated pathway, like you see in airports, one of those, the utricle and saccule will be detecting that. Or if you were on a elevator, they would be responsible for that as well. So way they work is they are a bunch of hair cells embedded in this gel-like material, and on top of the gel are these heavy stones called otoliths. And when you bend your head, those stones will move according to gravity, and those stones will drag the gel in the direction that would be associated with whatever head movement you're conducting, and that will bend the hair cells. And one way of bending will increase the number of action potentials being fired. The other way will decrease the number of action potentials being fired. And the brain then knows by how many action potentials are occurring which way your head is and pretty much what angle it's at. Again, it has to do with potassium movement. The semicircular canals, there's three of them, one in the horizontal plane, one in the vertical plane, and one more or less in a diagonal plane to those two. And each of those has a small region in it that called the ampulla, where there are hair cells. Now, in this case, there's fluid inside the semicircular canals, and when you move and rotate your head, because that's what semicircular canals are trying to detect, is rotation, is the fluid will rotate to account for a particular rotational direction. And this will bend hair cells in one direction or the other. And all three of these will report via the vestibular pathway to the brain. You should know the three layers of the eye wall. The three layers of the eye wall are: the outermost layer is the tunica fibrosa, and you should know two components in each of these layers. So you should know the sclera and the cornea. The middle layer is the tunica vasculosa, and it contains the choroid and the iris, and a third component is the ciliary body. Pick your two favorite out of those three. And then the innermost layer of the eye wall is the tunica interna, and that contains the retina, the fovea, and the optic disc in turn. Again, pick two of your favorite three. Know the components that light must pass through in order to form an image in the brain. So we didn't cover this specifically in that chapter, so this is a question you need to derive, and here's the answer. We begin, light passes through the cornea, then through the aqueous humor, then through the pupil, then through the lens, then through the vitreous body, then through the retina. Out of the retina, it goes through the optic nerve, The optic nerve, then it goes to the optic chiasm, where some fibers will cross over and others won't. And then it goes back to the lateral geniculate nucleus, or you can abbreviate it as the LGN of the thalamus. And then finally, back to the occipital lobe. That's the pathway. Know the 6 eye muscles, and this will help you with the cranial nerves as well. And again, I'm going to post what I want you to know for the short answer on the cranial nerves in a separate posting. The 6 eye muscles are the lateral rectus, medial rectus, superior rectus, inferior rectus, and the superior oblique and the inferior oblique. You should know that rods detect objects in dim light and work with black and white images. The cones are only cones are found in the fovea, though there are still many cones in the surrounding retinal region. But they function best in bright light, and they produce color images because there are 3 types of cones: red, blue, and green. Best of luck. Know all of these short answers. Again, just like the first 2 exams. Know them like the back of your hand, and you will do well, I promise. Take care, good luck, and we'll see you for the makeup exam and the final.